we've already done 2 sessions on Office 365. The first one was more or less an introduction to the product. The second one was the licensing. And this third one is really we're going to talk about implementing Office 365. Now, like our first 2 topics, we are not going to go really deep down into the down and dirty details as far as project management or the like. We're really just going to talk about some of the top level, some of the strategies and methodologies. And I'll be honest, putting together this topic, I had a little more trouble really putting it down in concise pieces, parts. So we'll get through this. But a couple of things I wanted to go over real quick. We have our traditional NASCAR stuff, all the wonderful things we do as far as IT services, including we want to be your IT department. We want to basically help you with your SQL and with your business intelligence and the like, and your project management. And to point out, we've been doing the Office 365 since before it was Office 365. It was known as BPOS. We work with over 100 companies, so we've got some experience here. Again, this is going to be a high-level discussion, and we're aiming at organizations that are less than 200 seats. So we're talking about the smaller organization, and we're really going to be talking about existing if you already have email through an Exchange environment. This is especially true for people who are running like small business server or the like. We will talk about alternatives if someone is using other methods, because it certainly isn't restricted to only Exchange. And the primary focus is really on the email, because as we've talked about before, email is really the core concept behind a majority of Office 365 purchases and implementations. There's other functions and features, whether it's talking about the OneDrive or the SharePoint, and now even the telephony with their E5 offerings, project management, business intelligence, even just licensing such as Visio or the like. But we're really going to be talking about the email and Exchange, because really when we talk about implementation, that's where 90% of the work and the effort goes into play. Okay? I just like having pictures of happy people. So you can tell that's the Microsoft slide that was added. One thing you can do is you can get a trial version of Office 365, the E3. The E3 is basically the whole enchilada. That's where you get Office Professional, all the OneDrive, the SharePoint, all that kind of thing. You can get that for a 30-day trial. I will tell you right now, that almost never really does any good. Especially with organizations that are larger than 25 people, because it's kind of an all or nothing thing. You can't have some of your email, with the exception of a hybrid, and we'll talk about that. Your email is either going to be served through your current provider, or it's going to be served through Office 365, with the exception, again, of a hybrid environment. Okay? And hybrid is really for larger organizations, and again, we'll get to that in a minute. But it is available. For an organization that is smaller than 25, then the trial makes sense, because the trial can be used to actually get you migrated over. So one of the first things you want to do when you want to actually migrate over to Office 365 is you want to know what you've actually got. And the best way to do that is to have some kind of audit. And what the audit does is you want to know how many mailboxes you're going to have. And you're also going to want to know how many of them are inactive. What do you want to do with the inactive mailboxes? Do you want to have that email history? And this is one of those things where whatever your answer is, it's fine. But understand that in some cases, the answer either A, makes the migration a little bit more complicated, because the more you migrate, the little more complicated it is, or it lowers the ability for you to get data afterwards. So if you have an email from employees from 5 years ago and you don't migrate them, well, you need to make some other kind of arrangements if you ever want to see that email again. And you may not want to, in which case that's fine too. And what are the average mailbox sizes? We'll talk about why that matters. Again, keep in mind that the Exchange, most of the migrations, or excuse me, most of the subscriptions and the licenses you get with Office 365 give you up to 50 gig of storage for your mailbox. That's a lot. And mostly, the largest I've ever seen as far as a migration was 20 gig. And that's very unusual. So with 50 gig of mailbox, you're probably going to have more than enough space. But you still got to copy the stuff from your server up to the cloud. That takes time. The more data you have, the more time that's going to take. So we want to know something like what's going on there. Then we have the domain registrars. And this gets a little bit convoluted, but when you have a domain name, such as simplex-it.com, The registrar is where we go to tell it where the DNS is, to tell it where stuff should go. So if you go to our website, which is www.simplex-it.com, DNS routes you to where the server is that has all that information. Well, we've seen this on more than one occasion where a company doesn't actually have access to that information. They think they do. This is especially true for smaller companies, but it turns out there was a third party who put the website up and they didn't have they didn't have access. As long as we catch it in time, that's not a big deal, but that's something you need to take a look at. You need to make sure you've got access to that. And then health tests. If you're talking about on an exchange, you just want to make sure that your Active Directory, which is how your network talks to itself, users and computers, all that integrate and have the security set up. You just want to make sure that that's okay, it's healthy. And then finally, anytime you're doing anything with your network, you verify your backups. You've got good backups. So this is just your first steps. You get an idea of what you're moving, you get an idea of approximately the size and complexity, and you get an idea of the health of your current environment. Fairly straightforward. And this is tricky. Mail-enabled devices and applications. And we did a video, or we did a YouTube video about 6 months ago on the Office 365 gotchas. And one of the biggest ones that we've discovered, and again, we've dealt with almost 100, are companies that have applications or devices where the device or the application actually generates email for your organization. The most common of those has been time clocks or scanners where you scan a document and it sends it out as an email. And the challenge with those is that if you have a server on premise, there's no real security. All right, you basically, if you're on premise, you got a password, you can go ahead and do it. So it's much easier to set up a relationship between that scanner and your server to send out emails. Well, 365 is in the cloud, and it's also a much more modern version, and therefore much more secure. So you need to make sure that your applications and your devices have the ability to be configured to work with a secure connection. Not all of them can, and in a lot of cases, it's a question of, have you upgraded it? Is it a recent purchase or implementation? And is it up to date? And it can be as simple as you contact the vendor and the vendor says, yeah, here's the website that tells you how to configure it. Because Office 365 is absolutely well established as a email delivery system of choice for small, medium businesses. But you need to make sure. The biggest challenge is when you have a device that has been there for 6, 8 years, hasn't been updated, there's no maintenance contract on it, it's old. Those are the biggest challenges. We have found solutions for just about every one of those that we've found. A couple of the solutions were not quite as pretty as they were originally, but they almost always worked. So, speaking of which, Office. If you're going to maintain your copies of Office, which means you're going to get an Office 365 license that doesn't include the on-premise, on your desktop license of Office, you need to make sure that the version is at least 2010. 2007 will still work, but it's not officially supported by Microsoft. And just keep in mind, Microsoft is now on Office 2016. So you've got 2007, 2010, 2013, 2016. 2010, 13, and 16 all work fine. 2007 might work fine. Okay? You also want to get preliminary license selections and counts. How many people just need email? How many people need email plus the Skype for Business, OneDrive, and SharePoint? How many people need Office? Which version, professional or standard? Just get some preliminary counts. And if you remember in our last webinar when we talked about licensing, depending upon the licensing model that you're using, you may or may not have a lot of flexibility to change the licensing. So if you go with CSP, if you counted wrong, no problem. You add licenses where you need them, you subtract licenses where you don't. If you bought open license, you paid less, but you're stuck. Whatever number you got, that's how many you got. You can add, but you can't take away. And Advisor is a little bit between the two. Then we have the two big questions. What's the migration method? How are we getting the data and the email from your current provider to 365, which is the migration method. We got cutover or hybrid. Cutover or hybrid is really how do you want to get the Band-Aid off? Do you want to rip it off, which is cutover, or do you want to peel it off, which is hybrid? And then finally is how do we keep our passwords straight? So because Office 365 is a separate organization from your network, and therefore by default, you set a user on the network, you set an email up in the cloud. They're two different accounts. They start out by having two different passwords, and we'll talk about that as well. By far and away, from the beginning when we started doing the BPOS and 365, passwords were the biggest pain in the butt for end users because they would have to change the password a lot more frequently than a lot of our customers were used to. We found ways to get around that, and we'll talk about that. So let's talk about cutover versus hybrid. Again, we've got our email is right now in our current provider, and we're just going to call it an exchange box, doesn't have to be. How do we get all that email, because that's valuable information, how do we get it so that it's up in the cloud so that our users can still access their old email, their contact lists, their calendars, their task lists, all of that good fun stuff? Cutover versus hybrid. To start right out of the gate, the hybrid method simply allows you to move them gradually. So you might have, let's say you have 50 users, we'll move 5 users up to 365 today, tomorrow we'll move 5 more, the next day, so on and so forth until we've moved everybody. So that your email is actually being provided and maintained by both your local box and in the cloud 365. There are some requirements on that. It has to be for an exchange. You have to have an existing exchange server, and that exchange server really has to be 2010 or 2013. You can migrate on a 2007 box, but it can be dicey. It's done in stages, and again, one of the key, your environment really needs to be spotless. And by that I mean that your Active Directory needs to be clean, your DNS needs to be clean, all of the domains that you're using have to be perfectly set up. There are problems, and in some cases, if there's an issue, you can fix the issue and then move forward. But we've run into situations where we've done the hybrid, and it turns out or done the configuration or discovery for the hybrid, and it turns out that there's an issue that you'd never think was a problem, but it really prevents the hybrid from being clean. Okay? The cutover. The cutover is essentially, that's the ripping the Band-Aid off. The cutover is a majority of the migrations that we've done. And that is very simply that we set up the users, we set up the data, we move all of the stuff over there in the background before we actually cut over, and then one night we literally throw the switch. So as of this point in time at 11 o'clock in the evening on a Sunday night, email goes through Office 365, and then Monday morning everybody is going to get their email through Office 365. It's obviously not as simple as that, but that's the concept. Okay? That's really the only choice. If you don't have an exchange organization, you're doing a cutover. So you're not really able to do a hybrid except for exchange environments. For smaller organizations, it's very simple to do. So as you and I had talked about, because you don't have that many people to migrate. For mid-sized organizations, there are some tricks and some tools that can be used. Security synchronization, we talk about the passwords, is really, there's 3 ways to do this. Number 1 is the default way, and that is where we have people who are logging onto their computers or the network with their credentials, and then they have their email, their Office 365 credentials, which could be exactly the same or could be wildly different. It's entirely up to you. Now, one of the challenges with this is that people hate remembering passwords, okay? And you can set it up so that it remembers their password for their Outlook, but it will, because 365, and you can make some changes to this, but by default, it'll ask for passwords to be changed every 90 days, and people will not remember what their password was originally because they saved their password when they went into Outlook. So I don't recommend this first method if you can at all avoid it. If you don't have an actual Active Directory environment, then you don't have a choice. That's how you're going to do it. But if you do have an Active Directory, you should try to synchronize this somehow. Which brings us to our second. Microsoft has a free synchronization with Active Directory that is called, it's been called AD Sync, it's also called DIR Sync. in a nutshell, what you do is you install an application on your server that will connect and communicate with Office 365 a couple times a day, and plus you can kick it off manually. And anytime you add, change users or passwords or distribution groups or any of the attributes of the users, it will synchronize that information up to 365. So a 365 user's password will be identical to the password that they use to log onto the network. So makes it much easier for a network administrator to add users to 365. When a new employee starts, you add that user to Active Directory, it will automatically copy them up to the Office 365, so within an hour or two, it will be there and ready to use, in which case then you just have to log on to 365 and assign them their license and you're ready to go. Fairly straightforward to implement. However, you need to make sure that when you implement it, that you are clear on how you are going to migrate your data. And this is where we get really geeky if we're not careful, because there are some ways, by default, it favors a hybrid, but you may not be looking for it to be a hybrid, in which case you need to make some changes. So talk to somebody, let's see, like us, to make sure it's done right, or it can be fixed relatively easily. The final is the single sign-on. The single sign-on is really overkill for this situation. This is where you're actually using Azure, Microsoft cloud-based services, and you would be setting up a copy of Active Directory, and what would then happen is you would have dynamic synchronization with Active Directory and 365 and other resources. Is there a question? What is the question? Yes, okay, so can you turn on the synchronization post-migration? Yes, it can be, but you're going to have to move some of the data and some of the users around. So if for example, you have done the migration initially with the standard users and passwords, you can add synchronization later. What you can't do is you can't add synchronization during the migration. That's not going to be pretty. So what you would do is you would essentially migrate or implement the synchronization, and then you'd have to do some tweaking in the background to attach the existing 365 users to your AD users, and moving forward, everybody would be synchronized automatically. Okay? So you got some good options there. Thank you for the questions. It shows you're listening. So single sign-on is really if you are looking to have a single sign-on for your organization. So why would you do this? Let's say, for example, that you have 6 web services or 6 services that you use. You use Salesforce, Amazon, Office 365, FedEx, and UPS. And every employee gets their own account. Well, when an employee leaves, you then have to change all the passwords for them. What SSO, and they'd have to remember all their passwords. What SSO does is it allows you to add those websites so that when when the user logs onto one site, they have access to all those applications, and that application actually that one site has all of the credentials. So that when an employee leaves, all you have to do is disable their account there. They never knew what their passwords were. It's actually pretty cool. It is a great way to maintain security for organizations who use a lot of web services and have a lot of users. You know, because you multiply those two. If you have 6 services and you have 20 employees, you have 120 accounts and passwords to maintain. The SSO makes it one-stop shopping, and all you have to do is change it at one place, and your employees are no longer able to, or are able to, access the data. We actually use 2 types of single sign-on. We use the Azure single sign-on because, you know, we're trying to eat the dog food, and we also use a third party. AVG has SSO as well, which is aimed more at just companies who are looking to standardize both on their web pages as well as mobile devices. Okay, so cutover migration. If you need to, so how do we go about this? Well, first of all, and again, we've done the preliminary work, so we've actually looked at the health, we've got the licenses, we've set all that stuff up. So now we want to set up the synchronization. And again, we can do this afterwards, but we can't do it in the middle. So We set up the synchronization or SSO if it needs to be. We then assign the licenses to the users. Again, all that can be done through the portal. And then we migrate the data. And really, it shouldn't be called migrate, it should be called copy. So what's going to happen now, and nobody's touching 365 at this point. So what'll happen now is that we will copy in the background the data up to that point. So if we started it now, we will be copying everybody's email data that they have received up to this Monday afternoon and copy that up to the cloud. It would have no impact on anybody's business. Their data would be fine, they would continue to use email the way they've been using email, all that kind of stuff wouldn't stop. But we do that in the background, and we can take our time. It doesn't matter if it takes an hour, a day, a week, 2 weeks. It doesn't matter, it happens in the background. We then prepare the desktops and users. In some cases, especially if they're using older versions of Office, we may have to do some patching, we may have to do some preliminary stuff. We then finally do a cutover. The cutover is literally exactly that. We take the plumbing so it's no longer going to the Exchange server, it's now going to Office 365. And at that moment, the emails are going to the new spot. Okay? We then do one final data migration. That's everything that has been received since the time we kicked it off. And then the final configuration for everybody's desktop. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Okay? Talk about the data migration. Data migration for a small client, again, like 4 or 5 users, there's really not much to it. You do the plumbing changeover, you don't even bother doing a migration early. You do the plumbing changeover, then you export all the data from where they used to get it from and you import it into 365. Done. Can be done relatively simply. There's some more configuration stuff that needs to be done, but it's fairly straightforward. For larger organizations, and larger organizations really is subject to interpretation, but for larger organizations, I would say more than 10, third-party tools are better. The third-party tools are essentially, they act as a middleman between your current email source and 365. In the background, they will do the migration of the email. They will also monitor it. They will give you alerts whether there's any issues. The 2 products that we work with, Skykick and MigrationWiz, for years we were pretty much solely MigrationWiz. We've started using Skykick, which does more end user configuration. Both are good products. But you use those for the larger. And for larger groups, the data is migrated in stages. So you can actually select which group, again, the subsets or the like. And again, migration, it can take days, it can take weeks. Because however much data you've got on your mail server, all of it has to be pushed that you want brought over. So we could very easily be talking about a couple 100 gigabytes. And we want to do this in such a way that the normal business that happens with the company, because this is taking up your internet pipeline, and it's uploading. And uploading is usually slower than downloading, depending on who your ISP is. So we throttle it. We limit the number of mailboxes that can be uploaded or the amount of data or pipeline that can be used so that we don't cause disruption of services, which is fine because nothing's going on. It's not affecting. The end user still has full access to their email. They're still able to do all their work, all their job stuff. Once that's done and we actually do the cutover, now we've got to work with end users. Primarily, most people are using Outlook. Okay? Outlook simply has, depending upon how you did it, either you have to create a new profile, which takes about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or you have a tool that automatically created the new profile. Now the question is that the new profile, it takes 5 or 10 minutes to create it, but it takes that amount of time for the part of the technician who knows how to create profiles. Great. If you have to go to each person's individual desk and you have to work with the end users and all of that kind of fun stuff, nothing takes 5 or 10 minutes. You're talking 15 minutes to 30 minutes just to show the end user, here's what's different, here's how it works, all of that kind of fun stuff. So you have to budget your time accordingly. We usually allocate between 30 and actually between 45 minutes and an hour per desktop when we're going to go desktop to desktop. And 9 times out of 10, it takes less time than that. But that 10th time is a doozy because that person had a unique configuration. They had multiple mailboxes. They had weird rules. They had signatures, all of that kind of stuff, which don't, when you're creating a new profile, don't migrate over. If you use the third-party tools, again, Skykick is the better out of the two of them, between Migration Wiz and Skykick, we're becoming more enamored with Skykick. That will actually do it for you, but there's a cost. So if you are willing to, and again, it becomes an economic of time or economic of dollars, you can choose how to do it. You don't really have a choice in terms of the migrating of the data. That has to be done, and for larger organizations, has to be done through third-party tools, or you're doing the Microsoft migration. When you do this, there's no loss or duplication of email data. So I want to be very critical here. You may have a period of time where, because you haven't been able to get to that end user's desktop and you aren't using any of the automated tools, where that person's Outlook doesn't work until that's reconfigured. But that person during the time can actually go to portal.office.com, sign on with their credentials there, and send and receive emails to their heart's content. So they'll still have access to their emails, and they'll still see new emails coming in. You can actually, again, you can prep the profiles ahead of time, depending on the tools you're using. And when you create a new profile, here's one other thing. When you create a new profile, it downloads all the emails and contacts and calendar all over again. So if you do have somebody who has that 20 gig mailbox, first of all, get them to archive online some of their data, but that person needs to download 20 gig worth of data the first time they create their Outlook. That's going to be a little bit on the slow side for them. And if you are doing this for 30 people at the same time, because you just finished this migration, you got 30 people all downloading on that same internet pipe at the same time. So beware of that. One of the general rules of thumb that we do is we basically say the first day that we cut over is going to be a lousy day. It's going to have interruptions. It's going to have people who are not able to get things as well as they can, but we take care of it that way. Cool. So the questions, the two questions are currently an Outlook-based signature and an OWA signature are different. The answer is they still are. The second question is whether or not you can actually generate a signature, and the answer is sort of ish, rounding up. So what you have is, Microsoft doesn't have a signature, they have the disclaimer. So what you can use in the disclaimer is the, seriously, please don't read this email, don't pay attention to it, it's not legitimate, I don't even know why I typed it in. What you can do is you can set up a corporate-wide disclaimer and insert in AD information. So you can turn the disclaimer into a signature of sorts. Now, I'll tell you, it's not as pretty as it doesn't even seem. Because you have minimal formatting capability as far as that goes, and plus the way disclaimers are handled in terms of when you have email chains, they're not handled the same way as a signature is. So the behavior is different. Now, there are third-party tools that you can use that will handle signatures and work very well with Office 365 or even on-premise. But as far as a standardized, centralized form of signature management, not really. I want to go over a couple of the Achilles heel one more time as far as implementation goes. So what we've got, the Achilles heel. If you have currently an Exchange server on-premise, then what is happening is your email is essentially all around here. They're going between your server and your workstation, which means they're traveling at about 1,000 megabits per second. Okay? So if someone sends an email to you that's to a group, it's downloaded once and then at your internet speed, and the internet speed is, depending upon how fast we've got it, under 20 megabits per second. So it's, a couple percentage at best of what you have internally speed-wise. All the traffic that happens now between employees within that organization are not using the internet pipe at all because everything is local. The minute you switch to 365, even if you're sending an email to somebody who's sitting 5 feet away from you, it has to go up to the cloud and then back down again. So depending upon, especially if you've got an environment where you are sending large file attachments within your building, the more of those you do, the more traffic you're going to create of uploads and downloads, which is not necessarily a killer, but you have to understand that. Similarly, If you have a lot of remote employees, people who are working somewhere else, they no longer upload and download to your site because they're going straight to the cloud. So the more remote employees you have, the less pressure you put on your internet connection. The more internal employees and communication they have between themselves, the more pressure you're going to put by going to Office 365. So the real question on this one is, if you're an organization that is constantly, employees are constantly moaning about the lousy internet speed, you may be making it worse by going to 365. And you definitely will make it worse the first day you do the cutover. Because again, we're uploading and downloading changes that have happened, and we're making it worse during the migration. The second Achilles heel, and we talked about this earlier, the second Achilles heel is the old applications and the third party. Devices, anything that sends emails from those devices or applications that don't go through Outlook. Almost always there's ways around them, but you don't want to discover when it's, especially if it's critical, the day after you've migrated that you've got one of those. And I will tell you, 9 times out of 10, contact the vendor. And if this is even a device within the last 3 or 4 years, the odds are the vendor has some solution that they've already implemented. And in the case of when they are much older devices, and again, the scanners that converted to email are the biggest ones we see. In those particular cases, be aware that sometimes the solution isn't as pretty as we'd like. A lot of cases just setting up an SMTP relay. And one of the biggest reasons here is twofold. Number one, when you've got an Exchange server, it's part of your network. So it already has that secure relationship between itself, other servers, devices, users. It already has that password connection. It already has the Active Directory integration. It already has all that. So it already trusts things that are attached in that network. So the bar is lower. Also, if you're looking to move from an older Exchange box, you've got an older Exchange box. So it may be running 2010, 2003, in which case those services, those servers, were not as concerned about security. 365 is not part of your organization, and it is based right now on Exchange 2013. It'll soon be Exchange 2016, which are much more concerned about security. So you can't, it's not going to allow you to connect less securely. So the older stuff you have, and again, this includes Office 2007, the older stuff you have, the more risk you have that it's not going to connect cleanly. And that's going to get, the security is going to be better, or the access is going to get worse, depending upon which way you want to look at it as time goes by. Okay, and again, the Achilles heel number 3, and this is money. A lot of companies look at it from the standpoint of they bought their server 6 years ago, 8 years ago, and they haven't upgraded it since. They bought their PC with that version of Office X number of years ago. You're absolutely right. If you look at it strictly as we bought something and we're going to run that version into the ground, then a recurring revenue, a subscription service isn't necessarily for you, because that's the way it is. It is a subscription service. As soon as you stop paying for it, you stop having it. And you're going to be given updates. You're going to get the latest version, all that good fun stuff. So from a budgeting standpoint, if you truly are looking to drive this into the ground, then you need to look at just purchasing it the way you did before. To give you a comparison, we just did a comparison for a client, a potential client, that was looking for about 150 seats, and they were just looking for $50 a seat, so it was $7,500 a year for their email, and that would have replaced it, all that kind of fun stuff. And we essentially, the licensing and the hardware and the software was about $50,000. And that is not, there's with nobody backing it up, that's with nobody providing the spam services up front, that's with nobody maintaining it, watching it, anything along those lines. But it was about $50,000 was the comparative price for about 150 users. Now, once we went through the details, and I wanted to stress, I will make a lot more money if the guy would have paid the $50,000. So from a greedy standpoint, I'd really prefer they buy the server. But from a financial standpoint, you're not going to, you're not going to get the track out of 6 years, 8 years out of a server like you used to. So, okay. And those are the topics really that I had to cover, and hopefully this is somewhat useful. If you have any questions, give us a holler. And otherwise, thank you very much for attending.
Yay.